Imagine two moderate-day corporate giants, say Apple and Google, locked in a bitter rivalry. They sue each other, poach employees, run attack ads, but what if they took it further? What if they hired private armies, built forts, and fought pitched battles for control of a vital resource? It sounds like fiction, but over 200 years ago, on the vast, windswept plains of Western Canada, this corporate war became brutally real. This is the story of the Pemmican War. It's a tale of a Scottish earl with a philanthropic dream, a bloody conflict between two fur trading empires, and the birth of a new nation. It's a story where boardroom strategy devolved into armed blockades, corporate espionage led to ambushes and assassinations, and the fate of a continent hung in the balance. At the dawn of the 19th century, the Hudson's Bay Company, a London-based behemoth, had dominated the North American fur trade for over 100 years. Their royal charter granted them an exclusive monopoly over a vast territory, a commercial kingdom larger than Western Europe. But they had a rival, the scrappy, aggressive, and relentless Northwest Company, based out of Montreal. The Nor'westers, as they were called, were masters of the interior, pushing the boundaries of the fur trade and challenging the HBC at every turn. Their competition was fierce, a period of intense, simmering conflict that was about to boil over. Into this volatile world steps an unlikely figure, Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk. He was a Scottish nobleman with a conscience, a man who saw his countrymen displaced by landlords and dreamed of giving them a new life on the fertile soils of North America. But the land he chose for his colony, a massive tract in the Red River Valley, was not empty. It was the homeland of the Ojibwa and Cree, the heartland of the fiercely independent Métis people, and most critically, it sat directly on the vital supply line of the Northwest Company. For the Nor'westers, this wasn't just a commercial threat, it was an existential one. Their entire operation, stretching thousands of kilometers across the continent, was fueled by a single high-energy superfood, pemmican. And the Red River was their primary source. Without it, their canoe brigades would starve, and their empire would crumble. Lord Selkirk's dream of a peaceful farming colony was about to light the fuse on a powder keg of competing interests, desperation, and simmering hatred. Before a single crop could be harvested, battle lines would be drawn. This is the Pemmican War. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in the drawing rooms and boardrooms of Great Britain. The man at the center of it all was Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk. He was a Scottish nobleman haunted by the plight of his people, who were being pushed off their ancestral lands in what were known as the Highland Clearances. He had a grand philanthropic vision to resettle these displaced Scotsmen in the vast, promising lands of North America. This wasn't his first attempt. By 1808, he had already established 2 colonies, one on Prince Edward Island and another at Baldoon in what is now Western Ontario. But he dreamed bigger. The easily accessible land along Canada's eastern coast was already settled. To build the colony he imagined, Selkirk had to look deep into the continent's interior, searching for a place with rich soil and a climate that could sustain a farming community. His eyes fell upon the Red River region. It was perfect. There was just one problem. The land belonged to the Hudson's Bay Company. The HBC was not in the habit of giving away prime territory, so Lord Selkirk devised a bold and audacious plan. If the company wouldn't grant him the land he needed, he would buy the company itself. And it was the perfect time to strike. The HBC, the old London-based giant, was faltering. A century of dominance had made it complacent, and the fierce, crippling competition from its rival, the Northwest Company, had taken a heavy toll. The HBC's stock value, once sitting at a proud 250%, had plummeted to a mere 50% of its value. The giant was wounded, and Selkirk, seeing his chance, began quietly buying up its shares in 1808. He was relentless. By 1811, he had acquired a majority stake, controlling stock worth £100,000. To give you a sense of the coup, the entire Hudson's Bay Company was valued at only about £150,000 at the time. He hadn't just influenced the board, he effectively owned it. And now he could finally claim his prize. In May of 1811, the company he now controlled granted him his territory, 116,000 square miles, encompassing most of the Red River watershed. This was a vast domain, an area that today is shared by Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, North and South Dakota, and Minnesota. Lord Selkirk had his land. His blueprint for a new life for his people was complete. But in achieving his dream through this stunning corporate takeover, he had declared war without firing a shot. He had just drawn a bullseye on the map, right over the heart of his enemy's most vital lifeline. The vast territory granted to Lord Selkirk was anything but empty. On paper, it was a clean transaction, a simple transfer of land, but in reality, this was a region teeming with people, history, and deeply entrenched rivalries. It was already home to numerous First Nations, as well as the vibrant and growing communities of the Métis people. And staked out across this landscape were the competing outposts of the two greatest commercial forces on the continent, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. For 100 years, the London-based Hudson's Bay Company had enjoyed a virtual monopoly over the fur trade. Their royal charter, granted by King Charles II all the way back in 1670, gave them exclusive rights to trade in any waterway connected to the massive Hudson Bay. Their business model was simple: build large depots along the coast of the bay and let the indigenous trappers come to them. But in the 1770s, that all changed. Aggressive new traders from Montreal, who would eventually form the Northwest Company, pushed west. The Nor'westers had a different philosophy. They didn't wait for the trade to come to them, they went inland, deep into HBC territory, building their own posts and making it much easier for native peoples to trade without making the long, arduous journey to the coast. This new competition hit the HBC hard. The old giant was forced to change its century-old strategy. To survive, the HBC had to push inland itself. In 1774, they built their first major interior post, Cumberland House, on the Saskatchewan River Delta. Soon, a network of HBC forts spread throughout the Northwest, sparking a period of incredibly intense competition. Picture it, two rival companies building forts, sometimes directly across the river from one another, their flags flying in defiance. This wasn't just business. It was a Cold War fought with trade goods and canoes in the heart of the wilderness. This was the volatile, supercharged environment into which Lord Selkirk, with his noble intentions, was about to place his colony. He wasn't just settling a piece of land. He was building a town in the middle of a battlefield. So if this land was already a battleground of competing interests, why would one more settlement, a small farming colony, be the spark that ignites a full-blown war? The answer lies not in land or furs, but in a single, crucial resource that was the lifeblood of the Northwest Company. The answer is pemmican. The Nor'westers operated a continent-spanning enterprise, with canoe brigades paddling thousands of kilometers into the wilderness. These men needed fuel, a high-energy, long-lasting, portable food source. That fuel was pemmican. It was a marvel of ingenuity: dried buffalo meat, pounded into a fine powder, and then mixed with hot melted buffalo fat, all packed into tough leather bags. This was the engine that drove the NWC. While the Hudson's Bay Company could afford to import most of its food and supplies directly from England, the NWC had to live off the land. In the heart of that supply chain was the Red River District. NWC traders would acquire pemmican there, ship it to a major depot on Lake Winnipeg, and from there distribute it to their brigades heading to the far-flung posts in the Athabasca region or back east to Fort William. So who was making this vital food source? The vast majority of it was supplied by the local Métis people. The Métis were the descendants of French-Canadian fur traders and their indigenous wives. By the early 1800s, they had formed large, distinct communities and were forging their own unique culture and national identity. The Métis of the Red River were known as the Bois Brûlés, or burnt wood, a name that came from an Ojibwe term for half-burnt woodsman, a reference to their lighter skin tone compared to the full-blooded First Nations peoples. They were masters of the buffalo hunt and the primary economic engine of the pemmican trade. The NWC also traded for pemmican with the local First Nations, primarily the Saulteaux, known today as the Plains Ojibwa, and with a small community of retired NWC voyageurs known as freemen. The Saulteaux shrewdly traded with both companies, and despite the NWC's efforts to turn them against their rival, they steadfastly remained neutral in the corporate dispute. But make no mistake, without the Red River pemmican, the Northwest Company could not operate. It was, as the source material states, absolutely vital. Years later, the NWC's director, William McGilvery, would swear in a court of law that his company simply could not function without it. Lord Selkirk, whether he fully understood it or not, had just placed his colony of farmers directly on top of the windpipe of the Northwest Company. And the Nor'westers were about to fight for every last breath. The partners of the Northwest Company watched Lord Selkirk's plan unfold with mounting horror. They didn't just see a commercial competitor or a new settlement on their turf. In Selkirk's Red River colony, the Nor'westers saw a direct and immediate threat to their very existence. They immediately launched the first salvo in what would become a long and bitter war. Their counterattack was multi-pronged, a surprisingly modern mix of corporate and political maneuvering. First, they went through official channels, lodging a direct protest with the Hudson's Bay Company. When that failed, they turned to the law, hiring a team of lawyers to dispute the legality of the HBC's foundational charter, the centuries-old document that gave them claim to the territory. But their most cynical tactic was a campaign of fear and disinformation. The NWC began publishing anonymous articles in newspapers aimed directly at the potential Scottish settlers Selkirk was trying to recruit. The articles painted a grim picture of North America, warning of the brutal hardships of the journey and the unforgiving harshness of the land. Then came the ultimate threat, a calculated line designed to prey on the deepest fears of anyone moving to a new world. The articles claimed that any settlers who dared to go would be massacred by Indians. It was a full court press of legal challenges, corporate pressure, and psychological warfare. But it didn't work. Despite the Nor'westers' best efforts to strangle the colony in its cradle, Lord Selkirk's plan moved forward, undeterred. The first shots had been fired, but the settlers were still coming. The conflict was about to move from the newspapers and courtrooms to the banks of the Red River itself. And so they came. In July of 1811, a convoy of Hudson's Bay Company and private ships set sail, carrying the first 25 Scottish and Irish families to the Red River colony. To pay for their new life, some had indentured themselves to the HBC, trading years of their labor for a plot of land. They were led by the newly appointed governor, Miles MacDonnell, a man the local First Nations would later nickname the Chief of the Gardeners. But these were no ordinary farmers. they came prepared for a different kind of planting. Fearing conflict with indigenous groups or the Americans, with whom Britain was on the brink of war, the settlers were heavily armed. Courtesy of the British Colonial Department, their cargo included 200 muskets, 4 brass field cannons, a howitzer, and 3 smaller swivel guns. They were equipped for a siege, but their greatest enemy would not be a human army. Their ordeal began almost immediately. After arriving at York Factory on the shores of Hudson Bay that September, their journey ground to a halt. There weren't enough boats to transport the settlers and their vast supplies inland. They were forced to spend a long, brutal winter on the coast, and then spent the spring and summer of 1812 building 4 new boats themselves just to continue their journey. They finally arrived at the colony site in the fall of 1812, at a bend in the Red River just north of where it meets the Assiniboine. That is now known as the Forks in Winnipeg. Racing against the coming winter, they began to construct Fort Douglas, named in honor of Lord Selkirk, which would house the governor, HBC employees, and the colony's stores. But the season was too late. Many of the settlers couldn't finish their huts and were forced to take shelter at nearby HBC trading posts for the winter. This decision proved nearly fatal. The HBC posts didn't have nearly enough provisions to feed all the newcomers. As the brutal winter set in, the colonists began to starve. In a twist of bitter irony, the only thing that saved them was charity from their sworn enemy. The Northwest Company, seeing their rivals' settlers on the brink of death, gave them provisions to survive. When spring finally arrived in 1813, so did more settlers, and the colonists at last began the work of building proper homes and planting their first crops. It seemed like a new dawn, but in the background, the Nor'westers were making their next move. An NWC partner named John Wills gave an order to his clerk, John Pritchard: buy up as much of the Red River pemmican as possible. Pritchard succeeded, acquiring a third more than the usual supply. The first salvo of propaganda had failed. Now the Northwest Company was beginning a new strategy to control the food, to starve a colony before it could ever take root. The gardeners had arrived, but a bitter harvest was coming. Next time on Canadian History with Stephen Wilson, the war of words becomes a war of deeds. Governor MacDonnell issues a fateful order that pushes the Nor'westers to the breaking point, leading to armed blockades, seizures, and a plot to destroy the Red River colony for good.